if you want to add anything to that at all.
Oh, look, don't get the wrong idea about me. I wouldn't say I love data, actually.
Okay.
I love the church and I love healthy leadership. And yeah, the data that we have in places like NCLS just helps bless the church with facts and a picture of what's actually going on in churches. But there's no substitute for the power and the calling of God in our churches. So yeah, just like to clear that up. Would you
Yeah,
guys
that's
just mind
fair.
telling me where you're all from? Just I can see your names there.
Yeah.
But if you just say, are you from a church or another organization, that'd be nice to know who I'm talking to.
Okay, so I'll go first. I'm Dave Milne from Winnina Presbyterian. I'm part of the Together for the Illawarra Evangelism and Discipleship team.
Okay.
Uh, Ron Thomas, City Life Church, which is a Pentecostal church in Wollongong, also part of Together for the Illawarra. That's about it.
Right. Yep. Johannes, you go next. I can see your name, so I'll say.
Great. Yeah, I am involved with Winnina Presbyterian Community Church as well. I'm the youth pastor there, but keen for things across denominations. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Adrian,
Yeah, I'm from City Life Church as well with Ron Thomas.
cool. Yeah, cool. Okay. And I can see Ray there.
Yeah, I'm with the City on a Hill Wollongong. We're a church plant
yep.
just over 2 years old.
Yep. Okay. Yep. Had a bit to do with the City on a Hill crowd in Melbourne.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, they were all heavily involved in the NCLS when we did it. And Henky, where are you from?
I'm here to help David. I'm David's assistant.
Okay, right. That's mysterious. Okay.
Henky, I will tell you, Henky is also at our church, but he is basically the founder of Together for the Illawarra, and
Right.
he really drives the whole ecumenical deal that's going on here.
Okay, great. And then we've got a new Ray who's just appeared as well. Hey Ray, where are you from? Just tell us what church you're at.
Cross Connect.
Okay.
Yeah. We're in Berkeley. We're just behind the Nantian Temple. It's a sort of
Right.
a place to hang around.
Yeah, okay. All right. Well, thanks for that. It's just I really appreciate knowing who I'm talking to. So I appreciate you just letting me know that. We did a summary of Illawarra churches using all the churches that took part in the NCLS. I realize that's not everybody in your network, and we produced results for that. But when Dave was giving me some guidance for what to do today, the interest he said was going to be in evangelism and discipleship in the church. So I'm going to actually speak most of the time more generally and not looking at the Illawarra results, and I'll explain why that is now. There's value looking at them, and I will get to them towards the end, but the most valuable thing you can do is look at your own church results, because we're not going to change the Illawarra by looking at the Illawarra results overall. Every church is different, and you do need to think about, if the church is going to change, it's going to change one local church at a time in terms of, if it needs a course correction, in terms of better discipleship or a different approach to evangelism. So I will look at the Illawarra results before we get to the end. But just to explain what I've prepared is what I think is the most useful thing for you guys and most stimulating today, which will be some stuff about Australia and about Australians in general and what we know about that. Because this is true of the people in the Illawarra as it is all over the place, and we're still getting these results out there whenever we present. So that's what I want to share mostly. So I'm going to share my screen there, I'm going to start by, this probably sounds like the bad news. This is the challenging news. How Australians view religion and religious organisations today. I've got this quote from Barney Schwartz, who was a religious reporter for many years with The Age, and one of the best religious reporters we've had in Australia. And he said, the story we typically hear in the media only covers three things for religion: priests molesting children, the church in decline, and the troglodyte, backward church holding back women and gays. And he says, you know, sometimes you'll get a positive story in the media, but it tends to just swing back to negative stories like this. And that's very influential. We know over the years, there's the last 100 years of censuses in Australia. And we know that the proportion of Australians who tick a Christian box and say, you know, that's what I identify with, has been going down. And for the first time in the 2021 census, that went below 50%. So 44% of Australians tick a Christian box and say they have some kind of affiliation or identity. Obviously, they don't all go to church. And nearly the same number, 39%, say I've got no religion. So that group, you can see that's the orange bar there, that's been getting bigger and bigger. Here's a picture of church attendance by proportion of the population over the last 70 years. So you can see that we didn't really ever have a golden age, probably over 50%, but you can see in the 1950s that it was really high, you know, higher than it is in America today. America's probably, you know, 30% now attend church. In Australia, we're below 20%. And those little dots are all different studies that have been done on samples of the population. So samples are never perfect, and therefore the dots come out a little bit different in different studies. But you can see a trend there, can't you? You can see that it's declined, but you can also see, I hope, that that line appears to be flattening out, and that actually the decline that's been going on is perhaps not as steep as it has been in the past. We have, that's what you can get from the census. We've run our own studies using samples of the population to find out more about people's spirituality. And I'm going to just show you some results from that. It's called the Australian Community Survey. And that's different years we've run it. We've also run it 2 more times since then. I didn't update this particular slide, but we ran it in May this year. So we've got some very fresh results, which we're just starting to push out. And you'll get a couple of them here, very, very fresh results. So we're still on how Australians view religion in Australia. We asked them, do you think religion is good for society? So not Christian religion, just any kind of religion. Because we know that, you know, up to 10% of Australians are from another religion. And what we found is that about 40% of Australians agree with that statement, that religion is good for society. And it's been going up and down, as you can see in that graph. The last time we did it, 24, isn't on the graph, but I've written it there. 41% of Australians agreed with that. So, you know, what we need to see from this is that not everyone's the same. You've got people who are very in favour of religion, and you've got almost an equal number who are unsure, and then a small number who say they think it's bad for religion. You know, so you've got people who say, look, I really agree that religion's good. Others who say, no, I'm split, or I haven't thought about it that much, but it's important. We asked Australians, what do you think religious groups such as churches what sort of roles should they fulfill in society? And the 3 top things that Australians say they're very comfortable with churches doing, the typical rites of passage, such as weddings and funerals, encouraging good morals, or teaching a standard of living, and supporting the poor. So they are areas that when the church is speaking in those areas, that's where there is the most support. But that's still only about half of the population. So there's the full list. Those top 3 that I just said are the top 3 bars there. And so about half of people said they think the church or religious groups like the church should fulfill roles like that. And then you can see the other things that churches do, that we know churches do. Sorry, I'll just go back a slide. They're supported by less people. So you've got, again, a real diversity of people in Australia. We need to remember that when we're thinking about who we're connecting with as churches. We need to think, well, who am I talking to right now? Who is this group that we're reaching out to? Or who are the sorts of visitors that are coming to our church? Because you'll get some people who are very anti, and some people who have got Christian history themselves. But what we can say overall, and what I think you've seen from the slides so far, is that there is a gap between church and community, and it's been growing over the past years, past decades. There's a demographic gap where churchgoers are more likely to be older. They're also more likely to be women. You probably know the typical split gender in a church is 60% women, 40% men. That's pretty much the same across all denominations. And churchgoers tend to be more highly educated. So there's a bit of a difference there. So then if the typical Aussie walked into church, they're more likely to be a bit younger. They're more likely to be maybe not all have a degree. And so churches should be thinking about what is it about the way we communicate that already might make it harder or easier for a new person to fit in. And we know from what we've just looked at the first set of results there that there's a sense of less hearts are in harmony with Christian values. So only a minority identify as Christian. About a third agree that religious faith is important in shaping their life. That was a question we asked during COVID, and we saw an encouraging number of people who were really reflecting on their own spirituality in that time. And less than half agree the Christian religion is good for society, which was another question we asked, not just religion, but what about the Christian religion? And in 2024, slightly more people said that they think the Christian religion is good for society than the religious question in general. But we asked other questions in the Australian Community Survey as well, so that we could go deeper with people. And so one thing we asked them about was their spiritual experiences and other behaviour. So as I said, I've started with the bad news. I've started with the sense that might make you feel, oh, gee, you know, things are pretty tough. But here's some facts about what Australians have told us when we've asked questions about their spirituality. So we asked people, have you ever had a mystical or supernatural experience? And 1 in 5 Australians say, yes, I have had an experience like this. Now, a lot of them will be churchgoers because that's, you know, we know about 15% of Australians go to church. They haven't all had that sort of experience, but a lot of them will be people who are Christian. But there are people who are very open. And then there's another group that's a small group that say, no, but I know someone who has, and another group that say, I believe it could happen. Those two groups make up another third of Australians. So we're over half of Australians at that point, or around half, who are open to mystical or supernatural experiences and experiencing God in some way. We need to remember that just because there's a negativity and a sense of perhaps not identifying with Christianity, that doesn't mean people are closed to some sort of spiritual reality. We also ask people, what sort of things do you do that appeal to you? Maybe you don't even do these things, but they appeal to you as a spiritual practice. And the number one thing people have said that they're happy to consider spiritual is spending time in nature or outdoors. Isn't that interesting that so that many Australians can picture that as a spiritual thing? And you can see the other figures there as well, listening to music, prayer and meditation, mindfulness practices are practiced by a third of Australians, or they think that's a good thing. Attending religious services, you can see there, 16% in this case said, yep, I think that's a good way. So you've got different ways that people experience, and I think this is good for us as church leaders to pause and say, are we missing any opportunities here? Are we so focused perhaps just on doing church or do church a particular way that we're not taking advantage of some of these other ways that people are very open to connecting with something higher? And can we show them something about Jesus through different ways? We asked them about when you're going through a time of crisis, and did ask this during COVID, how important are spiritual practices for your well-being? And a third of people said it's up the very important end, and then another third said it's fairly important. So again, during that time of crisis, many Australians saying, yeah, I can see a place for that. And I don't know if you had that experience with with people that you encountered during the COVID time, but we are sure there were many people who sort of did a fresh round of soul searching during COVID. It was almost like God knocked away a lot of the props that people had in their lives and really made them question, where was their meaning in their life? And I think that some churches were able to really capitalize on that, not just by preaching, but by showing care in that time as well. We also asked people, how spiritual do you think you are, and how religious do you think we are? We asked them 2 different questions, and this is a fascinating set of results here. So you can see we just gave them a scale 0 to 10 for the 2 questions. Where would you put yourself on these? And you can see up the end, the 0 end there, a lot of people, over a third, said, oh, I don't see myself as religious at all. And less people said, I don't see myself as spiritual. So no surprise probably for most of you that spiritual is a term that more people are comfortable with than religious. And we did an analysis on these 2 questions that we called a cluster analysis to see, are there different groups of people when you put these together? And in a rough sort of a way, we found that there were largely 4 different kinds of Australians. This is a really interesting result. The group you can see here up the top, the spiritual and religious, they mostly would go to church or go to another religious group. There's a group here that, sorry, my mouse is disappearing. There's a group here, another quarter of Australians say, I feel moderately spiritual or religious. They are probably very open to going to church, but don't go. And then you've got the largest group here, over a third, that say, I'm neither. And again, it's just good for us to be conscious that when we're connecting with the community, we're connecting with different kinds of people. And it's good for us to think about, who are we communicating with right now? What's their worldview compared to this group, or this small group of about 1 in 8 Australians who say, I see myself as spiritual, but not religious. A lot of these people have walked away from church, but they haven't walked away from everything. So, how do we communicate with them and show them that, perhaps the church that maybe hurt them, or Christians that hurt them, or family members or whatever that are, profess to be religious, have been the cause of their disillusionment. But what can we do to win them back and show them that that's not what God's like? Just a quick look at that result. I won't dwell on that because I've already shown you that. But a third of Australians say that spirituality was important. Many Australians pray or meditate. Almost a third do so, they say, at least once a week. And then you can see other groups, occasionally. So that's a significant thing that Australians do. By age, there isn't a lot of difference. There's a little bit of a difference that the Gen X group, it's my age group, here it's 50 to 64, so it's not exactly Gen X, but it's roughly. More of them say never, but still 1 in 5 say at least weekly I do that. So I guess my message there is, you can't make an assumption about any age group. There is a diversity even across age groups. We asked Australians what they think about Jesus, and do you believe in God? Do you familiar with the faith? What do you think about Jesus? And the God question, a quarter of Australians said, I believe in God. I believe there's a personal God. And another almost third said, well, I wouldn't say God, but I believe in something, higher power, spirit or life force. 1 in 5 Australians say, I don't really know what to think. And then a quarter say, yeah, I don't really think there is a God. So they've more made up their mind. So again, a real diversity, but it's not that, most Australians have turned away. Over half of Australians, or roughly half here, still believe in God or something like God, and they're very open to that. We need to remember that. We asked them about familiarity with the Christian faith. 6 out of 10 Australians say they have some familiarity. Either I've got a strong understanding, or I am familiar with most of the teachings. So, that's important to recognise as well. But then that means there's a lot who don't. We asked about Jesus. Who do you think Jesus was? And surprisingly, only half of Australians think he was a real person who actually lived. Nothing about his divinity here or what he did, but even was he a real person in history? Only half of Australians chose that option over saying, I don't know. And then a smaller number say, well, I think he was only a mythical or fictional character. And so, you know, we shared this result with John Dixon and some other people in his sort of work. You know, and this was his response that, you know, amongst historians, he reckons probably 99% of historians would say he was a real historical figure. Plenty of disagreement on exactly who he was or what he did, but no doubt really for people who are informed by history. And so we've got a job to do there, haven't we, just to even show that he was a real person before they consider his claims seriously. We asked about Jesus' divinity, and then a smaller number of people accept that Jesus was divine, God in human form, which makes sense. So the proportion think he was a real person in history, but not that he was divine. But then many people don't realize that's who he said he was. So, you know, we still have a job to do there in terms of informing people. We asked about, did Jesus rise from the dead? And surprisingly, a larger number of people said they believe in that in some way. So people view the resurrection in different sorts of ways, and Jesus doesn't have to be God to be risen from the dead. So people are not all clear on that. But there's some understanding of the resurrection. But over half of Australians don't believe in that. Many wouldn't even know what it's about. So I guess the reflection I want to leave you with here is that there is a knowledge gap about Jesus that the church needs to be very aware of. No longer can we be, you know, only preaching to people who we think already know this stuff. If we do, we're preaching to a minority of Australians. And many of those Australians are already in church. If you want to reach out to people who are not in church, we need to be accepting that many of them don't know very much at all. And if we don't bridge that knowledge gap, they're not going to get what we're doing in church. So another question: who goes to church now? We've got a few slides to share with you on that. During COVID, attendance went down, as you can see, but these are the bars where Australians are saying, oh, I go to church at least monthly. So this is not the weekly bar, that's why they're higher. And we all know it went down. And thankfully, it's been coming back up. So that's another thing to reflect on for your churches, how well they've recovered from COVID. Another thing that I want to show you is a slide about how well we're holding on to our children. Because there was a comment on that in the stuff that was offered by Dave to me before today. And here's a slide that shows exactly how well we're holding on to our children as they get older. So you can see young kids there, 95% of them in church families are going to church up to age 10 or so. Then as we get up towards age 15, we're down to 84% attend church, and then out of school age, it really drops off, as I'm sure you can see. And I think it's worth putting that picture together with what I've shown you on the earlier slides. The lack of understanding about Christianity and Christ we saw on the previous slides helps explain why we lose a large proportion of our children. It's not that they haven't had that teaching, of course they have, but because they emerge as adults into a very different culture than the Christian culture within the church, as they go to uni or as they step out into work or whatever, and we are not preparing them well enough for that transition. And so they just end up, you know, surrounded by people who don't believe, don't even know, and they think, why am I doing this? Highlights the real importance of youth groups and young adult groups, because that's where you provide the role models to young people of slightly older people and even adults who have held on to their faith and who have said, no, it is possible to be a Christian adult in Australia. But many don't get that, and they'll go and find some role models at wherever they end up, and it just becomes too hard for over half of people who have grown up in church to really hold on to faith in a meaningful way at the moment, which is really tragic. What's interesting, though, is we broke up going to church by age group in the Australians that we asked. And you can see again, here's my generation is the lowest attendance. Older Australians, including pre-war, pretty solid. But what was interesting here was people younger than me, well, they're attending, not such a shock because a lot of them have little kids and that's often where people return back to church. But what was a real surprise was the proportion of the youngest age group. Young adults though, see it's 18 to 34. This is in the Australian community. We said, do you go to church at least monthly? And a third of young adults said, I go at least monthly. Now, some of these people are attending online, right? They're clicking on, you know, some website, maybe even overseas, and checking out church that way. But that's going to church, you know, as far as they're concerned. We've got to remember that, you know, things like who you call your friend works a little differently if you're a younger person. And if you attend church, online is fine. And so I just want to highlight to you, this is not an isolated result. We've seen this looking through several different results we've had. Here's another result. How often do you go to church? So these are the circles here. The smallest circle is I go to church weekly. So here's the young people. I go to church weekly. And here's the oldest people over 65. I go to church weekly. See the same number, 17%. What about not weekly, but if you go 1 or 2 or 3 times a month? Amongst the older people, it's only small, that green group. Amongst young people, it's way bigger. So we're seeing the same result again there. So they don't come more often weekly than anybody else, but there's a significant proportion of young people in Australian society who are checking out church in some way. And that's you know, something that's important to highlight, and we can overlook it easily because they're not in church every week and we might not think they're as committed, for example, but they are there and they are checking out. We also asked, have you tried church in the past 5 years, and you're open to getting involved, or you might not have tried it, but you're open to trying it, but then you decided not to get involved. And 2 in 10 Australians said, I have tried in some way, or I came close to going to church, but then I didn't get involved. That's 2 in 10 in the last 5 years. And look, again, among young people, it's 3 in 10. So young people are showing an openness to trying church, to nearly trying church, as well. That is just not evident in an older generation like mine. So really, I hope, you know, encouraging results there for you to think about. So we've got to think about whether we're missing opportunities there. Also, then we just want to move on to how the church connects with the community. I've only got a few minutes left. So we asked people if they would go to church if they were invited, and a significant number are very open to that. Here are the reasons why they would go. Number 1, relationship. Also, if it was hospitable, if it was a place that did good works in the community. Remember, that was one of the things that half of Australians say we're very happy with the church caring for the poor and doing things like that. If it was convenient, if it was inclusive of different kinds of people, if I knew how long it was going to take and it seemed timely, if I had an opportunity to talk with people and you know, meet some people, and if it's clear what's happening, if I don't feel lost, if it's not weird when I get there. And out of all those, the most common thing is relationship. So the invitation of a friend and a connection with someone they know is absolutely paramount. 3 in 10 Australians said, if I was invited by a close friend or family, I'd go. That's pretty good odds, really, isn't it? That just not having that connection means that 3 out of 10 would say yes. Another 16%, so 1 in 6 said, well, I'm not sure if I would. Definitely worth asking. Now, I remember being shocked when my brother, who dropped out of church a long time ago, said he would come. I went out on a limb and asked him because my daughter was leading worship for the first time. And he said, yeah, definitely, I'll come. And he, you know, I was amazed. I almost didn't ask him because, you know, I thought it might just be do more harm than good, even bringing it up. So really encourage you to encourage your people to invite their friends to church and to other events. The danger, though, is the proportion of Australians who don't even know someone who's going to invite them. So we think that more than half of Australians don't have a close contact. And so this is where it's important for the church to think, how can we connect out with the community and make new friends? It's really easy to live in the bubble, isn't it? And particularly as Australia becomes more polarized in some ways, it's easy just to stay in a safe place. I want to just think about newcomers as we finish this huge focus on evangelism that we've had. What about when they come into church, a new person? What's a useful way to think about them? Newcomers have told us that the worship services are the most significant event that they can remember in helping them come to faith. So worship services play a huge role in that. The trigger that most say they first came was that something was missing. Another important fact is newcomers don't tend to shop around for church. This is a pretty sobering result. So a newcomer will go, I think I'll give church a go. Okay, so maybe they went to a cool wedding or an inspiring funeral or something and went, wow, that's really made me think, I think I'll give church a go. And then they choose somewhere and they go. And if it doesn't work out there, they don't tend to go anywhere else. So we as church leaders need to remember we've got one shot with a visitor, usually. We can't assume that, oh, well, sorry, it didn't work out for you here. I'm sure you'll find somewhere that does work out for you. For many, it's an experiment. It's a moment of vulnerability where they're, going out on a bit of a limb. If you put yourself in their shoes, going into a group of people they don't know and they do weird things like sing together and stuff like that. So very, very important. I'm part of a church plant in Parramatta City and, just helping people in the church stay focused on the newcomer and say, look, these are the most vulnerable people here in terms of spirituality. They got 1 foot in and 1 foot out. We've got to gear things so that they are comfortable. So very important to think about what's it like for the new person who walks into this church. And you can challenge your church members with, okay, if your brother or your child who doesn't go to church was to come, how would you want them to be treated? Okay, so treat the new person like that who's walked in this week. People, help them stay. We know that newcomers grow in faith gradually. They don't come in as the fiery convert usually. That's more the exception than the rule. Of course, we know people who do come to faith that way, but generally it's a gradual process. And so they start off less dogmatic in their beliefs. They don't fit in as well, and they'll soon pick up messages from the church as to whether that difference is tolerated and, even nurtured, or whether it's just too difficult to stay. So a few things that I want to leave you with, and then we're just going to have a quick look at the Illawarra churches. That Australians are less Christian but are not closed. There is a knowledge gap. The church has to do something about that. There are young adults who are very interested, and there are significant opportunities for us. I want to go to some thoughts about healthy churches now before we finish. I realise we don't have long, but that was really all evangelism. And I'm just going to say a little bit about discipleship and the challenge of getting a balance in there, because we've done some research recently that suggests there is a challenge in getting a balance. Just going to flick back to my presentation. I'm doing stuff behind the scenes here. Healthy churches, this would be a summary from what we've seen from our research over 30 years. Healthy churches serve the community. That's a positive way to connect. Healthy churches evangelize. Healthy churches nurture new disciples, and they grow people to maturity. That sounds a lot like probably the Rick Warren 5 points, I suppose, and various other people at very similar points. But I want to make a distinction between those last two. Why didn't I just say healthy churches do discipleship? Because that journey into new discipleship is harder in Australia today than it was for when us old people were young because of the gap that has grown in society. There's more of a worldview shift that needs to happen. And so the way we nurture new people who may be coming into faith is far more important because it could be a massive, massive change for them compared to what it was some decades ago. And then, of course, we want to see people grow to maturity, move into service themselves in some way and sharing their faith. So we've outlined a bunch of features of churches. And this is where I would encourage you to think about your own church and what is true in your own church. We found these from our research, regardless of what sort of questions we ask, these things keep coming up. These are our internal qualities. Everybody agrees on these. I think these are foundational to church life. The problem is that many people think this is all there is to church life, is make disciples, gather together and worship and be God's people together. But we've said, no, the church has to be outward focused as well. Of course, I know you guys would agree with that. It can serve the community. It can share faith with the community and invite people. And that's done on the grassroots level. It's the church attenders that do that. Of course, churches can run evangelism programs and things, but it's really the culture in the church where the church attenders invite their friends. The church attenders share their faith and share their faith in their families as well. And then including new people when they come in, welcoming them well, following them up well when they're sliding out. But then we've also found these qualities, which we called inspirational, and these are all leadership related. They're easily neglected or maybe not even noticed by some churches. And we have found that these are critical to long-term thriving in churches, having a vision, being innovative, trying new things, and having a leadership culture that empowers the gifts of the church attenders, not just the staff. And these I would all call culture. Then we've got our outcomes that we measure with NCLS. This is the easy bit. It's easy to measure things like young adult retention. We've looked at that today, newcomers, and then overall growth. But the thing I want to say is that based on all our research, these things are all important to look at, and they're all interrelated as well. They actually all affect each other, our research has shown. The last ones are outcomes, and then there's the inner and outer life and the leadership stuff. So some quick observations about the Illawarra churches. And I don't have slides here, but you've looked at the PDF, I hope. And so these are the things that I've noticed. But I would say again, these are in general statements. The most useful thing you can do is think about where things are at in your own local church and what are the different levels of health in the different areas. Why is that important? Because healthy churches evangelize well and produce disciples. Have a look at your own NCLS results. If you haven't done a church life survey recently, you can do it anytime. Don't have to wait till 2026, which is the next one. You can just go to our website and order one. You'll get the results back within 2 weeks of when you return stuff to us. So observations about the Illawarra churches. You are retaining more of your youth than the church figure, but that was largely because there were no Catholic parishes included. So the retention of youth in the Illawarra churches is the same as the Australian Protestant figure. Your newcomer figures have lowered a bit as they have generally Australia-wide. COVID has changed people's involvement for many, but of those who have remained in church, more say they are more involved than those who say I'm less involved. So that's good. In terms of the qualities of your churches and where the priorities are, the things that are most highly valued are sermons, teaching, and small groups. They're all higher than the Australian Protestant figures, and also youth stuff is highly valued. I affirm all of those. The highest priority is spiritual growth when we ask people what they think the priority should be. So there's clearly a strong emphasis on discipleship in these churches. What we saw during COVID was that less people had said they were growing in their faith. That's been the same across Australia, but it was the case in your churches. So the question is, has it come back up? Another thing that went down was belonging. People weren't gathering, or they weren't gathering as often, and that sense of connection, that sense of community went down. So very important area. Don't think of it as incidental. It's critical to evangelism and discipleship. As I said, our qualities are all interrelated. I'll give you a quick story. We're reaching out to uni students at our church plant recently, and we're going to run Alpha. We're going to run a short version of Alpha during their uni break. It's only going to go for 4 weeks, so it's just an intro thing. And we have been amazed how many have signed up. We thought like maybe 3 or 5 would sign up, and we've had over 10 say they're coming along tomorrow night. And you think, well, why is that? It's not so much that they are going, I've got real questions about faith. I've been thinking about it. We haven't had the opportunity to have many conversations with them, because what we've been doing is we've been putting on meals at the student village. And the reason they're coming is a sense of belonging. The reason they're coming is because they feel some connection. And that was strategic for our church. That was deliberate, because we know that relationship matters and often comes first as people move into a Christian environment. And of course, they see the faith, they don't understand it, but that's going to take time. So yeah, that belonging is really important. The vision in your churches is higher than typical. That's really good. What's about the same is innovation, and what's slightly lower is gifts and skills. So I think that's an area where people could think about other gifts and skills being encouraged. Here's my last slide for you. And I'll put this up I'll leave this up while we might ask questions as well. This is new work that we've been doing with the NCLS data. I'm going to make a distinction between organizational culture, climate, and behavior. I think this is a really interesting exercise for you to do in relation to your own church. So organizational culture is who are we as a church? What are our values? What do we stand for as a church? Often the leadership know that, but the members of the church don't. Maybe they're not on the same page. And the organizational culture is, well, what page is everybody on really? Like, what's it really like in this church? How do things really work? They might be on a different page in their theology, in their practice, in their level of importance for church. That determines the true emphasis of your church. It may agree with the mission statement on the wall, or it may not. We want it to, but the thing about culture is it's actually that it's an unconscious thing that sometimes it just doesn't actually line up. Think about businesses. Businesses can have one thing they say they're aiming at, but if you go and work there, it's not like that at all. To be there. And churches are the same. Organizational climate is another concept. And we're measuring both of these things in the NCLS. Climate is, what does it feel like for people to come to this church? Churches are very good at focusing on this, right? A lot of churches have seen success when you create the right atmosphere and the right experience. And so other churches said, right, we've got to do better at that. And there's validity in that, absolutely. I would say both of these things play an important role. What's interesting, that's it, guys. I'm not sure if I've just lost you. My computer is just...
You're still here.
I'm still here? Good.
We can still see everything.
Okay, good. Am I sharing the screen still?
No.
No.
Yeah, okay. Then my whole screen both screens just went black, so it's a bit of a shock. All right, something's happened, but my machine's come back to life slowly. But anyway, we don't hear each other, so how about we just have a few minutes for questions while we've still got time.
Where can I get a copy of this report? I'm on your site, but
Which report are you talking about?
the one you just gave.
The last slide?
No, the whole thing.
Oh, the whole thing. Well, I've put these slides together especially for you, so
okay.
I can turn these into a PDF and send them to you.
Oh, that'll be all right.
Yeah,
not a problem.
All right.
Thanks, Sam.
No worries.
Sam, in the aggregate, do you have any context for Australia versus the rest of the world, whether it be first world countries, developing countries, or even direct comparisons between Europe or US?
Yeah, we've done some comparisons. We actually, the NCLS started in Australia, and it's something that's been molded in a pretty unique way for us. But we have had partnership with American organisations and British and New Zealand who have all run a similar sort of church life survey using our model. So we do have some comparative stuff. It's worse in the UK and it's better in the US would be the summary. The UK has gone more towards secularizing than the other Western countries, and so even smaller proportion of the population go to church. And in the US is still a significantly larger number that do. I said about 30%. I think that's still pretty current. But clearly there's a lot of polarizing in those countries too, between people who are anti and people who are pro. Yeah, is that the sort of thing you were wondering about, Ray?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I wanted to see what the context was comparatively. Are we facing anything that's better or easier or more difficult? And
yeah,
you answer that question.
Yeah, look, I think the strategies I'm talking about would work. They work just the same pretty much in those other countries too, but with some changes. What's really different in Australia is we have far more ethnically diverse churches, even than the US. We probably have double the number of churches that are ethnically diverse. So somebody in the US, some author said 9:30 on a Sunday morning is America's most segregated hour in the week.
Martin Luther King said that.
Yeah. And so they do have a large, probably 14% of their churches would be considered ethnically diverse using the metrics that people use. In Australia would have about double that, about 28%. So that's a real advantage for us. And many denominational leaders are saying, hey, it's our ethnic churches that are doing best. We're still experiencing great growth and church planning in that area. It's these jaded Aussies, who are post-Christian that we're still figuring out how we reach them. So yeah, again, just go back to saying we really need to think about who are we connecting with when we're reaching out, because there are different views and our message needs to change, whether based on their worldview, or they won't be able to understand what we're saying.
Can I also ask a specific question in regards to healthy churches? One of the criteria was healthy churches, quote, serve the community. Is there a definition for what serving the community is or looks like?
Well, I wanted to say healthy churches connect with the community, but then I say that a lot of people just think about, we put on evangelistic events, we put on something like carols in the park or something. Now that's good too, but it's the service. It's where the church is actually doing something that people already think churches should be doing. That people are very, very open to that. Of all the things that my church does, I go to a big church in Parramatta, but the fact that this church still has a program that feeds the homeless in one of the parks in Parramatta is a huge thing for a lot of new people, because they want to know we're not just some, middle-class bubble where we're all highly educated and we're all just looking after ourselves, and church is just an extra thing we do. But the fact that we're still caring for poorer people and less fortunate makes a huge statement. Probably hardly any of those people from that program come to church. Some of them end up in other churches when they come to faith, because we're a little bit out of Parramatta. But I do want to emphasize that service. I'm not saying it's easy. There's a lot of churches that do service and it kills them, or it drains a lot of resources. But it's an important connection, that it's not just about proclamation, and more in Australia, it's not just about proclaiming the gospel to people because they don't know what it means. And they've got to see that love in action and feel that sense of connection and belonging before they start to understand what it means.
Thank you, Sam.
I just got a quick question about the Illawarra breakdown. Interested, it's mainly Protestant. And is there a distinction there between the traditional churches and the Pentecostal churches? I think there's probably little reporting from the Pentecostal churches in the Illawarra.
Yeah, Dave could probably fill you in another time on who's in that profile. So there were some Pentecostal churches that took part, and so their people are in there. But yeah, the Illawarra profile is not. I couldn't balance the data. Like I couldn't when we do an Australian result, we balance the data based on how many churches there really are in all these denominations. And that's why when we do it every 5 years, our results come out so similar, or we get such good trends, because we've balanced the data. It's called weighting the data. For the Illawarra thing, I couldn't do that, but it is what it is. It just shows the, was it nearly 3,000 people who were in different churches. And there are some differences between Pentecostal and other Protestant churches, sure. Less and less in terms of the way they conduct worship and things, but there are some differences. A big difference in age profile in a lot of cases. And there are plenty of big Catholic parishes in the Illawarra. It's just that we didn't include them in these results. And I know that, you know, there has been some connection, or at least in the past, between you guys and people like Jude Hennessy in the Diocese of Wollongong, who's, you know, a great guy, very strategic thinker, you know, and the Catholics have a massive mission themselves. In 1 in 7 Catholics don't go to church. And so their primary mission is, let's just get those guys back, you know. The Catholic churches are already biggest denomination by far in Australia, but they see these people who, many have a strong Catholic identity, but they've lapsed in church for some reason. And they obviously have a large percentage of people who go, but are pretty nominal in terms of their sense of real commitment. And that really does set them apart from the other denominations.
Thanks, Sam. I have a question regarding the openness of the younger people in that. Was it 25 to 34 or something like that? There's 34%.
Yeah, 18 to
turning
34.
up. That's very encouraging. What would you say sits behind that new interest or renewed interest in that group?
God, I wish I understood that better. All I can do is speculate, and we can all do that. But it's interesting when you think about what happened in the 60s, right? When the real sexual revolution happened, those kids who were growing up were obviously the most affluent generation that had ever been. But they also looked at their parents and said, well, you guys have stuffed the world up. You know, you've started 2 wars. The place is a mess. There's still wars going on, and we're just going to do something different. We're just not interested in your values. You know, that'd be a way of summarizing that. I mean, every younger generation says that to some degree, but they had pretty good ammunition in the 60s for turning away. If you look at the young people today, they see an older generation of their parents who are more often anti-God, right? So the children of the Gen Xers are the Gen Zs. And it's the Gen Zs that are more open to church. I wonder if they're partly reacting to their parents saying, well, you guys haven't really got it all together. You're saying, don't give church a go. We walked away from church, but we don't think you know, what you've got is much of an answer either. We're actually pretty open to church. I think that's part of it. And then the other thing to say is that if the 60s generation was the most affluent that had ever lived, the Gen Z generation today is the most connected that have ever lived. And so they're hungry for information. They're willing to look at anything. And I think that's resulted in a greater openness to spirituality that some of their parents and grandparents have said, oh, you don't want to look at that. You know, there's nothing there.
It's interesting also that Australian connecting with spirits connect their spirituality with the outdoors, music, poetry, and I think the other one was prayer and that kind of thing. So it seems like innovation in those spaces would be interesting. Are you seeing anyone doing anything useful in innovation in that? Well, that's just one area, but you might be seeing some good stories out there, Sam. Have you got a specific story, mate?
I wish I knew more about that area. I can't say I know much about that area. But you know, even, you know, look at Carols in the Park, for example. It's a beautiful outdoor space that's got spirituality in it. I know a church in Sydney that used to do a dawn service on Easter morning, Easter Sunday, but they used to go down to this beautiful spot on the side of the harbour where there just happened to be this giant stone cross in the park. And so they'd gather around there, and I know the community noticed that. And so I think there are ways that we can do this and, you know, make use of nature, make use of natural beauty, and say, hey, the Lord's is the earth and everything in it. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, and actually make a statement there that you don't have to come into our old-fashioned building, you know, and drink our mediocre coffee if you don't want to. There's other ways too that you can connect.
Thanks. Anyone else got a question?
I have one. So Sam, in one of the slides you mentioned that the retention of the youth. I think this is talking about Illawarra. Basically, what is really important for them is number one, sermon teaching, and then there's a youth program. Number three is about small groups. So I presume there's a question about small groups there in the statistics here. So I guess based on the assumption, is there any data or any indicator? I'm not talking about Illawarra, I'm talking about Australia wide, whether people actually the first attendance, because you mentioned is about invitational, whether that invitational is currently in Australia is more to the Sunday worship service, because I believe that's the definition of worship service, or is actually more the small groups, because now I guess most churches have small group. Is there any indicator on that?
Look, church on Sunday is the main shop front that the churches have. That's always been the case. It probably always will be. So it's the obvious place to think about how sensitive are we to the new person here. A small group may be a terrible experience for a new Christian or a visitor. It depends on the culture that's in that group. I've done some research in that last slide that I was sharing about organizational culture and climate. I've done some research where in certain kinds of churches, small group attendance actually turns newcomers away because the experience of the groups, I don't think, is geared towards the newcomers. And yet in other churches, attendance at small groups increases the number of newcomers. So then you see that result is not telling you whether small groups are good or bad. It's telling you it depends on the church culture. So that's what we're going to do more studies in this area, that there are different kinds of churches. And if you think, look, that church down the road's done a fantastic job with small groups. They've got lots of new people. We should do more small groups and get new people in. It just might not work out that way for you because you haven't actually figured out, well, what's that church like in other ways? How do they treat new people? What's the experience like for a new Christian in that church? And there are some churches where getting people into small groups has not helped, it's actually hindered. And that is, I think, partly related to the fact that church is so focused on the discipleship of the more mature Christians, right, that the baby Christians get left behind. And they go, look, this obviously isn't for me. I don't get this jargon. I don't know what they're talking about. I'm not into the expression that they do in this church. This obviously isn't for me, because everyone else seems to love it. So churches really need to think about, that's why I wanted to make that distinction between nurturing new disciples compared to, growing people to maturity, because I think particularly in Australia today, where people come into church fresh and they go, look, last year I didn't even believe in God. I hadn't even heard of Jesus, and I've got a whole revolution going on in my world. They need to be discipled in a different way to a kid that's grown up in church and, has got heaps of knowledge and is fine with everything in the Bible, has no questions about authenticity or validity. And that's the challenge we have. It's more like a mission field. You think if people go to the mission field, they spend years studying the culture to try and understand how we're going to communicate in a way that they're going to get it. And that's what we need to do more and more in Australia now, because we've actually got a whole subculture that is anti-Christian or ignorant.
See, that was really evident in that sort of hardened group of about 37% who were saying they really didn't have any kind of spiritual belief or any belief in God, and the 24% who actually didn't believe a higher being or God existed. That's a surprisingly high number to me, actually.
Yep. And so I think it's good for you to be asking yourself, who are the visitors in our church? And the answer is probably going to be, who are our church attenders inviting along? Because most visitors come because someone asked them. But, do they tend to be, they're pretty comfortable with the church world. Well, you're gonna run church differently for them compared to, now these people have got no idea, like they don't have a church background. or the spiritual but not religious, who have been somewhat disillusioned. They're a little bit angry maybe with church. That's really important to think about. Who am I communicating with? You might do some things very differently, and you might have to run the risk that your regular attenders who are long-term committed Christians are not real happy with the change in emphasis. You might need to remind them what being missional is about. And there are churches that have done this, that have said, look, if you want to get deep into discipleship, join a home group. Okay, church is about reaching the lost, and they've made that very clear decision. So I'm not saying that all churches should make that decision, but if you go to a church, if you visit a church and go, gee, this place is shallow as hell, I don't know, they might go, yeah, that's deliberate. We're doing that on purpose because we're reaching the people that don't know anything.
It's really helpful.
Sam, can I ask just one more question? That's to put a fine point on it. You said many in their mid-teens or up to 30 leave the church. It seems like what you're saying is those people that leave are rejecting the experience of church, but not the values or the message of church. Is that fairly correct?
Look, I think that there's probably a lot of truth in that, Ray. I don't know if you came up with that or if I did. I think that there is some truth in that they might walk away because they've had a bad experience, or they actually had a negative experience, or they just can't relate as much. They're just not into it now. They liked it when they were a kid, but now it's a bit boring. But they probably haven't walked away from the values as rapidly. But what we know is over time, as people stay out of church, that does change too. The beliefs become weaker, the values change. But for some, it's very values driven as to why they had to stop. Like some people will say, I just felt like I had to stop. I couldn't keep going because I could no longer reconcile what I'm hearing at uni, what I talk with my friends at the gym about, and then what I experience at church. And I just had to make a choice. It was like the rubber band wouldn't stretch any further. And we as a church have to do better at discipling people and helping them form an adult worldview that's Christian, not just a child's worldview that is Christian, that can't actually survive in the adult world.
An adult worldview as opposed to a child's worldview.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, look, that's me speculating. I've got to say, I'm not speaking as a researcher there. I'm speaking as, someone who's had faith myself for over 40 years. And, I've got one child that's a pastor and two that are not going to church. And, I've seen many come in, many go out. And I'm part of a church plan. I think, what is going on here? And the ones that have left, it's very predictable. And the ones that leave during uni, they just don't get any help with their worldview. And they just can't do it anymore.
Can I ask how you might draw distinctions between what is a child's worldview and then how it transitions to an adult worldview, what the differences might look like?
I don't know. Maybe you should read on that, because again, I'm not claiming to be an expert on that. But it's the lack of dogmatism in an adult worldview that says, look, I know life is complicated, and the Bible does give some very clear answers, but some people can't digest those answers easily, and we've got to be really careful how we share our values, because they're going to hear something else than what we say. So it's partly that, child worldview is very black and white, very simple. And you get into teenage years, and then it starts to get more complicated, and you get the kids that stay in the Christian bubble and like it. And some of them even go into ministry, and it's probably the only way they could have stayed a Christian. And then others say, no, I want to live in the real world, and I actually want to know whether I can be a Christian in the real world. And their role models are they're more nuanced in their beliefs. They're more understanding that people vary. It's complex. Yeah, my first training was in Christian counselling, counselling from a Christian worldview, and I suppose that's where a lot of this thinking comes from.
I guess the other thing you've been saying. Oh, you go ahead, Johannes. You haven't asked anything.
Thanks, Dave. Just a specific question that I noticed in the Illawarra statistics from 2016 to 2021. People inviting someone that have invited someone in the last 12 months has gone down.
That's largely because of COVID. So inviting just wasn't possible for many churches during COVID, because churches weren't meeting all the time, and if they were, there were risks and issues involved, and so a lot of people either went, "Look, I can't invite my friends," or "I can, but now's not the perfect time." So I wouldn't say there's a terrible reason behind that other than COVID. But the question is, will it come back up? So we're past that now. Or have people gone, "Oh, look, I'm just not really into inviting people. It's, I don't like the hassle. We want to see that figure come back up." We know that the one figure that tracks most closely in the church with visitors and people coming to faith is, guess what? People inviting their friends to church. It's not rocket science. So we need people to be inviting, because that is the main driver of why people come. It's relationship, and then they may come to faith. So yeah, it is concerning to see it go down, but it's a COVID thing, I'm sure.
Thanks so much, Sam. Oh, Ron.
No, if we're finishing, that's fine. I've got some broader questions about some of those comments, but I'm happy to leave them alone.
Sure.
I don't think if you want to ask them, I think we've got 5 minutes. I think it's been so helpful just to continue the dialogue.
Just so that Sam knows, my master's thesis was in reaching third culture Australians,
right?
Special cultural Australians. And my conclusion, looking at the NCLS data over about 15 years, was that basically the model of invitation to an attractional church was a failing model. And so we're looking at about 1 in 100 responses a year from that, model, which to me was a very poor result. So I started doing research into alternate versions of missional engagement, which led me down the track of missional communities and very strongly community-oriented groups, et cetera, et cetera. Just so you know, currently, like Crossway Melbourne are having about a 10% conversion growth experience, which we've been looking into pretty closely.
I've looked into that as well.
So which is interesting. And look, there's some demographics there and stuff, but that's probably beyond the scope of this. I guess my fundamental question is, have you guys done much work on alternate approaches to making disciples apart from inviting to the shop front, which is reflective of a very strong church growth model of church life? So I'm just wondering if you've done any research on that, or if it's sort of a if it's just not in the data.
No, look, we have. I mean, we just ran a webinar last week, which would be up online now, about innovation, and the need to try different things. I really struggle with this area, Ron, because I don't think I would say that the invitational or attractional model is a failing model. I would just say it could be doing a lot better. And we haven't found any other model that is working on a large scale as well. I mean, the reason we do research is because not all churches are the same. And we want to say, what do the most healthy, powerful churches have in common, right? And that's why I showed you that picture of the 9 core qualities, that they are the qualities that churches that are stronger in those qualities are reaching far more than, one new convert a year. We've got churches with 20% newcomers. So they've got like 4 or 5% new converts a year, which might not sound like a lot, but when you contrast it to the norm, it's incredible. Because we also have a lot of churches with 0 newcomers, right? So we want to study them all, because we want to know what are the strong churches have in common, and it is what the weak churches don't have. So when you average it all out, you go, gee, that doesn't look real crash hot. But there are churches that are doing great, and we want to know, we want to highlight their approach, and we've done that. We do that with the core qualities. But we need an innovative edge.
So because that's very interesting. You aggregated those into those core qualities, and is that? I guess I want to ask, how indicative is that of those particular churches that are actually more fruitful at that level?
Those core qualities have essentially arisen from correlational studies. So they correlate with church growth and with newcomer numbers. Churches that are stronger in those qualities, particularly, are better at newcomers. Church growth is a more complex issue because it's actually the outcome of about 6 different processes. So stuff gets lost in the noise, but newcomers is one of those processes, and it's the one that we care most about in terms of that's kingdom growth. One of the other processes is young adult retention. We want to hold on to our kids. So the core qualities correlate with churches that are stronger in those areas. And then it's up to us to look at, well, what are those qualities? How does that actually work? And that's where I've started to unpack it a little bit further and say, well, some of these things are culture, and some of them are climate, and some of them are behavior. And that's some new thinking that we're going into now.
Yeah, good.
And the missional stuff, really important. And it's messy in the missional world too, because a lot of those people are angry and have walked away from church, and that's why they're looking for an alternative. But I would not say the church is dead. I would just say it's failing to adapt to a very rapidly changing Australia.
Cool.
Hey, Sam, do you publish a contrast between the churches that do well in those 9 core qualities and those that don't do well? Is because that what you've just stated is the observed difference in terms of effectiveness is very interesting, quite instructive to people, really.
Not in those terms. It can sound a little pointed when you say it like that. What we do is we say the core qualities are important. That's what we say.
Yeah, I guess so. But to show, I mean, the National Church Development, NCD, I mean, Schwartz did a similar kind of thing, didn't he? And he identified his 8 core qualities, and you've got to have all the slats on the barrel above a certain level.
Yeah.
Do you have
some
that?
of his some of that stuff is not supported by research at all. It's just based on his theology. And logical German thinking, but some of it is based, but it's not as, I would say, it's not as good research, not as robust research. But I have looked into it. They actually haven't published very much of their underlying studies, but I have been able to find some.
Okay.
But what's interesting is even with that, it came up with almost the same list as our 9.
Okay. Hey, Sam, I think we've gotten more from you than we originally asked in every way. So I just really appreciate the time you've been able to give us and the thought and the insights that you've provided. I think we need to it'll be great for us to spend some time reflecting and asking each other and talking among ourselves.
Sure.
We might come back to you in a couple of months, Sam, with another request, in which we'll just say, "Hey, Sam, give us a bit of your time. We'll take whatever you want to share with us."
Well, look, I love doing this kind of thing, and I sit behind a computer most of the time, doing quality control on data and writing reports, and every now and then I get to do some cool new analyses. But what I love is the communicating, because the reason we exist is to help churches thrive, and to help the kingdom of God. It's not just so we can stroke our beards and say, isn't that interesting? So I love this part. I love the resource side of things and the communicating. Happy to talk anytime. But look, God bless you guys. You're the ones that have taken part and given us data to work with in the first place.
Yeah,
so much. This has been so helpful.
Yeah. So I take it we can distribute this presentation to others in the Illawarra.